Thrown out before winter, she built a driftwood dome for nothing. Elias Voss, who had hauled army freight through 11 Dakota winters, told her, "When the north wind comes, that thing will open, and your boy will freeze before dawn." She had $11, a 6-year-old son, and no way to build shelter before the freeze. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 8 hours. But 4 months earlier, Ada Marin had never built anything meant to survive a plains winter. She had arrived in Dakota Territory in August of 1887 with her husband's promises still warm in her ears. The Missouri Riverland would make them whole, he had said. The ferry work would pay through winter. By spring, they would have timber enough to raise a proper house. By September, he was dead. The ferry cable snapped on a crossing swollen with late summer rain. 3 men went into the water. 2 came out. Ada Marin stood on the bank with her 6-year-old son, Thomas, and watched the river carry her future downstream in pieces. What followed was not grief. There was no time for grief. What followed was arithmetic. Her husband had borrowed $43 from his brother Milo to stake the claim. He had promised labor in exchange for use of the wagon team. He had signed nothing, witnessed nothing, secured nothing in writing because they were family, and family did not require contracts. Milo required contracts. He arrived 3 weeks after the burial with a paper drawn up by an attorney in Yankton. The paper said the team belonged to him. The paper said the cabin frame, half raised, roofless, nothing but vertical posts and a single cross beam, had been built with his lumber and therefore remained his property. The paper said Ada owed him $43 plus interest calculated at 8% from the date of the original loan. Ada had $11.40. She had a cook pot, a spade, a dull hatchet, a river hook, 2 blankets, 1 iron kettle, and a cracked auger. She had a son who asked every morning when the house would have walls. She did not have $43. She did not have a team. She did not have a way to haul timber or cut boards or raise a frame alone. Milo took the wagon. He took the mules. He took the cabin frame by disassembling it plank by plank and loading it onto the wagon bed while Ada watched from 30 feet away with Thomas pressed against her hip. "You can keep the river lot," Milo said when the wagon was loaded. He gestured toward the cut bank where the Missouri had chewed the earth into a tangle of exposed roots and standing water. "No one wants it anyway. Floods every spring, roots too thick to plow. You're welcome to it." He said it like generosity. He said it like he was doing her a kindness by leaving her the one piece of ground no sensible settler would touch. Thomas asked why Uncle Milo was taking their wood. Ada did not answer. She watched the wagon roll east toward Milo's claim, toward the cabin he had already built 3 winters ago, toward the wife and 2 children who would sleep warm while Ada figured out how to keep her son alive on a riverbank no one wanted. The first frost came October 9th. Ada woke before dawn to find ice on the water bucket and Thomas shivering under both blankets. The lean-to she had scraped together from driftwood and salvaged canvas leaked at every seam. Wind came through the gaps like it owned the space. The fire she had banked the night before had gone cold. She rebuilt it with numb fingers. She boiled water for porridge. She watched her son eat with his shoulders hunched and his breath visible in the morning air. $11.40. She had spent 80 cents on flour, 60 cents on salt pork, 20 cents on lamp oil. That left her $9.40. Enough for food through November if she ate nothing herself. Not enough for lumber, not enough for a stove, not enough for nails, hinges, glass, roofing, chinking material, or any of the 100 things a proper cabin required. The cut bank lot measured roughly 200 feet along the river and 120 feet deep. Most of it was tangled with cottonwood roots, driftwood deposits, and the wreckage of spring floods past. The ground nearest the water stayed soft enough to sink a boot heel. The ground farther back rose slightly, but remained shadowed by the trees that lined the bank. It was, in every practical sense, worthless for farming. The soil was too wet, too shaded, too choked with debris. It was worthless for building because any structure near the water would flood, and any structure farther back would require clearing roots as thick as a man's forearm. But it was hers. Milo had made sure of that. He had given her the one piece of land that would make her failure look like nature's fault instead of his. Elias Voss arrived on October 14th. He rode a gray mare that looked as weathered as he did, 58 years old, spine curved from decades of hauling freight, hands scarred from rope burns and frostbite, and one incident with a runaway wagon tongue that had taken the last joint of his left ring finger. He had contracted with the Army for 11 years, running supply lines between Missouri River posts during the seasons when the river froze too thick for boats and the roads turned to frozen ruts. He had survived 21 winters on the northern plains. He had buried one hired hand who froze to death 6 miles from a relay station because the man refused to listen when Voss told him to stay with the wagon. He was not cruel. He was not unkind. He was simply the kind of man who had seen enough death to recognize its approach from a distance. He had heard about the widow on the Cutbank lot. Everyone within 10 miles had heard. A woman alone with a child camped in a canvas lean-to on flood-prone ground with winter 8 weeks away. The story was already being told as a tragedy. People were simply waiting to see how the ending would unfold. Voss dismounted and walked the lot without speaking. He studied the lean-to. He counted the driftwood stacked beside it, barely half a cord, most of it too green to burn clean. He looked at the tangled roots along the cut bank. He looked at the cottonwood standing dark against the October sky. Then he looked at Ada. "You cannot winter here," he said. Ada was splitting kindling with the dull hatchet. She did not stop. "I have no other place to winter." "Then you will need a house." "I am aware." Voss walked to the lean-to and put his hand on one of the vertical poles. The whole structure swayed. Canvas rippled. A gap opened where the roof met the wall, wide enough to fit 3 fingers through. "This is not a house," he said. "This is a windbreak that has not yet fallen down." "It has not fallen down yet. The first hard blow will take it. The first real snow will collapse the roof. The first deep freeze will kill your fire because you cannot seal the draft." Ada set down the hatchet. Thomas was inside the lean-to, playing with a wooden horse his father had carved the previous spring. She could hear him making quiet sounds, galloping the horse across the blanket. "What would you have me do?" she asked. Voss gestured at the lot. "Build. Properly. You need a structure with solid walls, a sealed roof, a working chimney. You need 4 walls that do not move when the wind pushes. You need a door that closes and stays closed." "I have no lumber." "Then you need to get lumber." "I have no team to haul it." "Then you need to find a team." "I have $9. Voss stopped. He looked at her. He looked at the lean-to where Thomas was playing. He looked at the thin stack of driftwood that represented everything she had gathered in 3 weeks of work. $9, he repeated, and 40 cents. He was quiet for a long moment. The wind picked up. The canvas snapped against its frame. "Sawn lumber from Yankton costs $8 per 100 board feet," he said slowly. "You would need 400 feet minimum for a structure this size. That is $32 before hauling. Hauling adds another 8. Nails, hinges, roofing materials add 12 to 15 more. A small stove costs $11. Glass for a window costs $4. He did not need to finish the calculation. They both knew. "You cannot build a proper house," Voss said. "Not with $9, not alone, not in 8 weeks. "Then what?" "Then you leave. You find a family who will take you in for the winter. You work for your keep until spring. In spring, you sell this lot for whatever you can get and start over somewhere else. No one wants this lot. You said so yourself. Then you take the boy and go back to wherever you came from." I came from Sioux City. My parents are dead. My husband is dead. My husband's family has taken everything except this ground. Voss was silent. If I leave, Ada said, I leave with nothing. If I stay and fail, I still leave with nothing. But if I stay and succeed, you will not succeed. Then I will fail here instead of failing somewhere else. Voss shook his head. He walked back to his horse and took the reins. Before he mounted, he turned. I have buried men who thought like you, he said. Stubborn men who believed they could outlast a plains winter through will alone. Will does not keep your sun warm when the temperature drops 40 degrees in a night. Will does not seal the gaps in your walls when the north wind comes. What seals them then? Wood, mud, plaster, tar, materials you do not have and cannot afford. What if there were another way? Voss swung into the saddle. He looked down at her with an expression that was not contempt. It was closer to exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who had watched too many people die from optimism. There's no other way, he said. There is only the way that works and the way that kills you. Cabins work. Sod houses work. If you have a team to cut the blocks. What you are doing here, he gestured at the lean-to, the scattered driftwood, the tangled roots along the bank. This is not building. This is waiting to die. He turned the horse. When the north wind comes, he said over his shoulder, that lean-to will open by morning, and your boy will freeze before dawn. He rode east without looking back. Ada did not sleep that night. She sat by the fire and fed it driftwood piece by piece, watching the flames consume fuel she could not replace fast enough. Thomas slept against her side, wrapped in both blankets, his breath shallow and warm against her arm. $9.40, half a cord of green wood, a canvas shelter that swayed in every gust, 8 weeks until deep winter. The arithmetic did not work. Voss was right. She could not build a cabin. She could not afford lumber. She could not haul logs alone. She could not do anything that required money, tools, labor, or time she did not have. So she would have to do something else. She thought about the river. She thought about the cutbank lot that Milo had called worthless. She thought about the tangle of roots and driftwood that everyone saw as obstacles. She thought about her father. He had worked the ferry crossing near Sioux City for 18 years. Every spring when the floods came, he spent weeks clearing debris from the cable housings, logs, branches, root masses torn loose from upstream banks and carried downstream until they caught on anything solid. Most of it he burned. Some of it he salvaged for firewood, but some of it, the strange pieces, the twisted pieces, the root balls that came down with the mud still clinging to them, he studied. She remembered standing beside him in brown water up to her knees, helping him free a root mass from where it had wrapped around a piling. The roots were not straight. They curved and hooked and tangled into each other. When she tried to pull one loose, the whole mass tightened instead of releasing. See that? Her father had said. He knocked 2 root sections together, showing her how the curves interlocked. Straight wood breaks alone. Crooked wood catches. She had not understood what he meant. She was 9 years old. She was cold and wet, and wanted to go back to the house where her mother was making dinner. Now, 17 years later, sitting beside a fire that could not keep her son warm, she understood. Straight wood broke alone. Crooked wood caught. She began the next morning. The cutbank lot was covered in driftwood and root tangles because the Missouri deposited debris there every spring. For 3 weeks she had seen this as a problem, an obstacle to clearing the ground for construction. Now she saw it as something else. She waded into the shallows where the first hard freeze had not yet reached and began pulling loose root masses from the mud. They came up heavy with river clay, twisted into shapes no sawmill could produce. Some were as thick as her thigh. Some branched into 5 or 6 limbs that curved back toward each other like interlocking fingers. She dragged them to higher ground and let them dry. She sorted them by size and shape. She looked for the pieces that hooked, that curved, that would catch against each other instead of pulling apart. By midday, she had 24 pieces laid out on the bank. By evening, she had 40. Thomas helped her carry the smaller ones, not understanding what they were for, just happy to have work that made his mother's face look less frightened. When the sun went down, Ada stood over her collection of twisted wood and began to see something that was not a cabin. The idea came in pieces over the next 3 days. She remembered earth lodges. Her father had talked about them, structures built by people who had lived on these rivers long before any settler arrived. Round, low to the ground, covered in earth and sod. Not the tall peaked cabins that white settlers built, but something closer to a mound, something that looked like part of the landscape instead of standing against it. She remembered muskrat hollows. She had seen them in riverbanks during spring floods, small dome chambers dug into the earth, sealed tight, warm enough that the animals survived winters that killed cattle left exposed. She remembered what Voss had said, cabins work, sod houses work. But Voss had also said what she needed, walls that did not move, a roof that did not collapse, a door that closed and stayed closed. He had not said those things had to be made of lumber. He had not said they had to be rectangular. He had not said they had to stand tall and proud and look like what a house was supposed to look like. He had only said they had to work. The design began to form in her mind like a map drawn in fog. A circle, 12 feet across, small enough to heat with limited fuel, large enough for 2 people to sleep and cook and live. Low walls no higher than her shoulder, a domed roof that curved instead of peaked, spreading wind pressure across the whole surface instead of catching it against flat plains. The frame would not be lumber. It would be the interlocked root masses she had been pulling from the river. Crooked wood catches. The pieces would hook together, each one bracing against the others, spreading strain through the whole structure instead of concentrating it at joints that could fail. Over the root frame, she would weave willow branches, flexible, abundant along the riverbank, thin enough to bend into the curves she needed. The weave would create a mesh that held its shape without rigid joints. Over the willow, she would pack clay. River clay was free. She could dig it from the cut bank with her spade. Mixed with grass and ash, it would seal the gaps between the woven branches. Layered thin, allowed to dry between coats, it would form a skin that blocked wind without cracking. Over the clay, she would stack sod. Cut blocks of river turf, roots and all, laid against the outside of the structure like a second skin. The sod would insulate. It would shed rain. It would anchor the whole structure to the ground. She would dig the interior floor 6 inches below grade to add thermal mass. She would build the entry as a tunnel facing southeast, away from the prevailing north winds, low enough that cold air had to climb to enter, and warm air would pool at the sleeping level. It would not look like a house. It would look like a burial mound, like an animal den, like something that had grown from the earth instead of being built on top of it. But it might work, and might work was better than cannot work. Nell Harker came on the 4th day. She was 32 years old, married to a man who farmed a quarter section 2 miles east. She had 3 children and a practical mind that calculated survival in bushels, cords, and days until thaw. She was not cruel, and she was not kind. She was simply honest in a way that frontier women learned to be honest, without softening, without comfort, without false hope that could kill as surely as cold. She brought a sack of dried beans. Charity, though she did not call it that. She called it surplus she could not use before spring. She also brought questions. "They say you are building something," Nell said, watching Ada sort root sections by length. "They say it is not a cabin." "It is not a cabin." "What is it then?" Ada gestured at the circle she had marked in the dirt with stakes and twine. "A shelter." Nell walked the perimeter. She studied the piled roots, the willow bundles, the clay Ada had begun to dig from the cut bank. She did not speak for a long moment. "It is round," she finally said. "Yes. Cabins are not round." "This is not a cabin." Nell crouched beside the pile of roots and picked one up. It was curved like a shepherd's crook, thick at one end and tapering to a tangle of smaller branches at the other. "You cannot build walls from these," she said. "They have no straight edge. They have no flat face. You cannot stack them." "I am not going to stack them. I am going to interlock them." "Interlock them how?" Ada took 2 root sections and demonstrated. She fitted the curve of one against the curve of another, showing how the hooks and bends gripped each other. When she pushed them together, they tightened instead of separating. "Crooked wood catches," she said. Nell watched. Her expression did not change. And then, willow weave over the frame, clay over the willow, sod over the clay. "Wet clay freezes before it cures. You will have ice walls, not solid walls." "I will cure it in layers, thin coats. Let each one dry before the next." "You do not have time for layers. Winter is 8 weeks away. 7 weeks now. 7 weeks. And you think you can build a house from river trash in 7 weeks?" Ada set down the root sections. Thomas had wandered close, listening. She did not want to have this conversation in front of him, but she had nowhere else to send him. "I think I can build something that does not fall down in the first storm," she said. "I think I can build something that holds more heat than that lean-to. I think I can build something that gives us a chance." "A chance is not a house." "A chance is all I have." Nell stood. She brushed dirt from her skirt. She looked at the circle of stakes, the piled materials, the woman who had lost everything and was trying to build something from what remained. "And if it falls in the night?" Nell asked. Ada met her eyes. "Then it falls faster than a cabin I cannot build." Nell did not reply. She left the sack of beans and walked back toward her wagon without looking back. Word reached Milo within 2 days. He arrived on horseback with 2 neighbors, men who had watched him dismantle the cabin frame, men who had witnessed him take the team and wagon, men who had said nothing because property disputes between family members were not their concern. Now they had a different concern. The widow on the cut bank lot was building something strange. The widow who should have starved or begged or fled was hauling river debris and stacking it in circles. The widow was either mad or desperate, and either way it was worth seeing. Milo circled the half-started structure on his horse. The root frame was just beginning to take shape. 3 main arches set into shallow trenches, curving from ground level toward a center point that Ada had marked with a vertical pole. The arches did not look like construction. They looked like the ribcage of some large animal, half buried and rotting back into the earth. "What is this?" Milo asked. Ada was digging another trench for the 4th arch. She did not stop. "A house." "That is not a house. That is a beaver pile with a smoke hole." The 2 neighbors laughed. Thomas, sitting near the fire, heard the laughter and understood what it meant, even if he did not understand the words. "It is what I am building," Ada said. Milo dismounted. He walked toward the frame and reached for one of the root arches. Ada stepped in front of him. "Do not touch it." "I am simply looking." "You can look from there." Milo's face tightened. He was not accustomed to being told no by the woman he had cast off his brother's land. He was not accustomed to seeing her still here, still alive, still working instead of surrendering to the obvious fact of her situation. "You are packing mud on drift because you cannot admit you are beaten," he said. "You know you cannot survive here. You know that thing will not stand. You're building it anyway because pride will not let you leave. Ada drove her spade into the earth and leaned on the handle. Her hands were raw. Her back ached from 3 days of hauling roots. She had eaten nothing since morning and would eat little tonight because the flour was running low. "My pride is not your concern," she said. "Your pride is making my neighbors talk. They say the widow Marin is living in a mud hut like a savage. They say she has lost her mind." "Let them say what they like." Milo stepped closer. His voice dropped so the neighbors could not hear. "When that thing opens," he said, "do not come to my door with the boy. I have my own family to feed. I cannot take on charity that chose its own suffering." Ada did not flinch. She did not step back. She held his gaze until he was the one who looked away. "I will not come to your door," she said. "When this is over, you will come to mine." Milo laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. He remounted his horse and rode away without looking back. The two neighbors followed, casting glances over their shoulders at the strange woman and her stranger construction. That night Thomas asked if they truly lived in a beaver lodge now. Ada had heard the phrase, Milo's phrase, already spreading through the scattered community like smoke through a drafty wall. The Beaver Lodge, the Beaver Pile, the Mad Widow's Den. She looked at her son in the firelight, 6 years old, already learning that the world measured people by what they built, already learning that what his mother built did not measure up. "It is not a beaver lodge," she said. "What is it?" "It is a house for people who cannot build what other people build." "Why can we not build what other people build?" "Because we do not have what other people have." Thomas considered this. He was old enough to understand that they had lost the wagon and the team and the wood for the cabin. He was not old enough to understand that they had also lost the assumption that someone would help them, that family meant safety, that winter could be survived simply by doing what everyone else did. "Will it keep us warm?" he asked. "I am trying to make it keep us warm." "Uncle Milo said it would fall down." "Uncle Milo said many things." "Is he right?" Ada pulled her son close. The fire cracked and popped. Beyond the circle of light, the half-built frame rose against the October sky like the skeleton of something that had not yet decided whether to live or die. "I do not know," she said, "but I'm going to find out." She began setting the main arches the next morning. The technique came from memory and improvisation combined. Her father had shown her how roots interlocked, but he had never built anything from them. The women at the Sioux City settlement had talked about sod houses and dugouts, but they had never described a round structure with a woven frame. Everything she was doing existed somewhere between what she remembered and what she invented. The first arch went into its trench smoothly. She had chosen a root mass with a natural curve that matched the diameter she needed, roughly 12 feet from base to base, rising to a height of 7 feet at the crown. The thick end seeded into a hole she had dug 18 inches deep. The tapered end met the center pole and rested against it, waiting for the other arches to complete the support. The second arch was harder. It was heavier, shaped differently, and she had to maneuver it alone while Thomas was too small to help with the weight. She dragged it to the trench, lifted one end, and felt her shoulders burn as she tried to hold it vertical while sliding the base into position. It slipped. The arch swung sideways and knocked the center pole loose. Both pieces crashed to the ground. She stood breathing hard for a long moment. Then she reset the center pole, repositioned the arch, and tried again. It slipped again. Third try. Fourth. Fifth. On the sixth attempt, she used a loop of rope to hold the arch in place while she kicked dirt around the base. It held. The center pole stayed upright. The two arches crossed at the crown, their curves pressing against each other. She tied them together with more rope and stepped back to look. It was not much. 2 curved pieces of driftwood root leaning against each other like tired dancers. but it was something, it was a beginning. By the end of the first week, she had 4 main arches in place. They formed a rough dome shape, each one bracing against the others at the crown. The structure swayed when she pushed against it, but it did not fall. Thomas asked if the house was done. "Not yet," Ada said. "Not nearly." The willow came next. She cut it from the thickets along the river, selecting branches that were thin enough to bend but thick enough to hold their shape. She worked in the shallows where the willow grew densest, her boots soaking through, her hands turning red and numb in the cold water. Each branch had to be cut, trimmed, and carried back to the site. Each branch had to be woven through the root arches over and under, creating a mesh that would hold the clay she had not yet begun to apply. It was slow work, tedious work, work that measured progress in inches per hour instead of feet per day. By the end of the second week, she had 1/4 of the dome covered in willow weave. 3/4 remained bare. Winter was 6 weeks away. She was not moving fast enough. She worked longer days. She cut more willow. She wove until her fingers cramped and her vision blurred in the failing light. She ate less so Thomas could eat more. She slept less so she could work more. And still she fell behind. The first real setback came on the 15th day. She woke to find ice on everything. Not just the water bucket, the willow she had cut the day before, the clay she had dug from the cut bank, the rope she used to tie the arches. Ice had formed in the gaps of her lean-to overnight. Thomas's breath frosted in the air as he slept. This was not deep winter cold. This was just October on the northern plains. But it was a warning. It was the weather telling her that her deadline was not 8 weeks or 6 weeks. Her deadline was whenever the first sustained freeze arrived, whenever the clay became too cold to work, whenever the ground hardened beyond the reach of her spade. She had been calculating based on calendar time. The weather did not care about calendars. She worked faster. She made mistakes. She wove willow too tight in one section and too loose in another. She had to tear out half a day's work and redo it. She lost time she could not afford to lose, and the temperature kept dropping. On the 17th day, she met Marta Red Elk. She did not know it at the time. She was crouched over a pile of willow, trying to bend a branch into a curve it did not want to take. The branch kept splitting. She had already ruined 3 pieces trying to force the same angle. A voice came from behind her. "You are making the curve fight itself." Ada turned. An older woman stood at the edge of her work site, 50 years old perhaps, face weathered by wind and sun, hands rough from work Ada could not identify. She wore a blanket coat and moccasins. Her hair was gray at the temples and braided in a style Ada did not recognize. "I'm trying to weave it through the frame," Ada said. "I can see what you're trying to do. I can also see that you do not know how to do it." The woman walked closer. She picked up one of the willow branches Ada had ruined, split halfway down its length where the bend had forced the fibers apart. "You bent it cold," the woman said. "Green willow bends. Dry willow breaks. Cold willow does neither. It splits." "I do not have time to soak every piece." "You do not have time to ruin every piece either." The woman set down the broken branch and picked up an intact one. She walked to the fire, Ada's small cooking fire, barely producing enough heat to warm hands, and held the willow close to the flames, rotating it slowly. "Heat first," she said. "Then bend. The wood remembers fire better than it remembers force." She bent the heated section into a smooth curve. The fibers held. No splitting, no cracking. "Where did you learn that?" Ada asked. The woman handed her the curved branch. "Where did you learn to build a round house from river roots?" "I did not learn it. I'm inventing it." "You are reinventing it. This shape is older than your grandfather's grandfather. The people who lived on this river built round houses covered in earth before anyone came here looking for farmland. I know. I have heard stories. Stories are not enough. The woman looked at the half-finished frame, the uneven willow weave, the pile of clay that had frozen overnight. You have the idea. You do not have the knowledge. Then teach me. The woman studied her for a long moment. Ada could not read her expression. It was not pity, not judgment, not the dismissal she had grown used to from Voss and Nell and Milo. It was something else. Evaluation, perhaps. Assessment. Why should I teach you? The woman asked. Because my son will freeze if you do not. Many suns have frozen on this river. Teaching one woman will not change that. Then why did you come here? The woman was silent. She looked at the structure, at the fire, at Thomas, who had emerged from the lean-to and was watching from a safe distance. I came because you are doing something I have not seen in many years, she finally said. Building with what the river gives instead of fighting against it. Most settlers look at this ground and see only what is missing. You looked at it and saw what was here. Is that why you will help me? That is why I will see if you can learn. She turned and walked toward the willow thicket. Come. I'll show you which branches to cut and which to leave. Ada hesitated for only a moment. Then she followed. Marta Red Elk did not explain who she was or where she had come from. Over the following days, Ada pieced together fragments. A Yankton, Dakota woman, widowed young, living with married kin upriver, spending winters patching lodges and smoke caps for people who still remembered the old ways. She did not come every day. She appeared without pattern or announcement, stayed for a few hours, demonstrated techniques that Ada had been approaching through trial and error. Then she left. Her first teaching was the willow work, heating, bending, weaving in patterns that strengthened instead of weakened. She showed Ada how to soak thinner branches overnight and pre-bend them around stakes driven into the ground, letting the wood take its shape under tension instead of force. Her second teaching was the clay. One thick coat cracks, Marta said. You see this. You have seen it in stream beds, in dried puddles. Thick clay splits when it dries because the outside hardens faster than the inside. She demonstrated with a small section of the willow weave, applying a thin layer of clay mixed with chopped grass. Thin first, let it cure. Then another thin layer over the cracks, then another. The layers bond together. The grass holds them. The result is stronger than any single thick coat could be. But the weather is turning. I do not have time for layers. You do not have time for walls that crack open in the first freeze either. Marta was right. Ada knew she was right. But every day spent waiting for clay to cure was a day not spent finishing the structure. Every layer added was time subtracted from the shrinking calendar. Work in sections, Marta said, as if reading her thoughts. Seal one quarter while the clay cures. Move to the next quarter. By the time you return to the first, it will be ready for another coat. It was a system. It was a way to keep moving even while waiting. It was the kind of knowledge that could only come from experience, from winters spent in round houses, from generations of learning what worked and what killed. Why are you helping me? Ada asked on the 5th day of Marta's intermittent visits. Marta was showing Thomas how to mix grass into clay without clumping. The boy was elbow-deep in mud, happier than he had been since his father died. You already asked me that, Marta said. You did not answer. I answered what I wanted to answer. She worked the clay with her hands, folding and pressing until the texture was even. Thomas watched, imitating her movements. The people who built houses like this are mostly gone now, Marta finally said. Their children live in square cabins. Their grandchildren will not remember what a round house looks like. What you're building is not exactly what they built, but it is closer than anything else on this river. She handed Thomas a ball of properly mixed clay. I am not helping you survive, she said. I am helping this survive. By the end of the 4th week, the structure had begun to look like something. The root frame was complete, 4 main arches intersecting at the crown, 8 secondary arches filling the gaps between them. The willow weave covered 3/4 of the dome, creating a mesh that flexed under pressure but did not break. The first layer of clay had cured on the north-facing side, and Ada had begun the second layer while working the first coat onto the south side. It was still open to the sky in places. The entry tunnel existed only as a trench and a few stacked sod blocks. The fire pit was dug, but not lined. There was no sleeping platform, no smoke cap, no door. But it was something. It was more than nothing. And then the wind came. The storm arrived on the night of November 4th. It was not the deep winter blizzard that would come later. It was an early season blow, wind out of the northwest, gusts that rattled the lean-to canvas and sent sparks spiraling from the fire pit. Not deadly, not yet, just a warning. Ada woke to the sound of something tearing. She crawled out of the lean-to and found the clay on the northwest side of the dome cracked in 3 places. The wind had found the seams between the willow weave and the cured clay, had pushed fingers of cold air into the gaps, had frozen the moisture in the clay and expanded it until the surface split. She stood in the dark with wind cutting through her clothes and looked at her failing work. 3 cracks, each one 2 feet long, each one deep enough to see the willow weave beneath, each one proof that Nell had been right. Wet clay freezes before it cures. She had not moved fast enough. The weather had overtaken her. Thomas called from the lean-to, frightened by the wind, asking where she had gone. I am here, Ada called back. Go back to sleep. She did not go back to sleep herself. She crouched beside the dome and studied the cracks in the moonlight. She thought about what Marta had said about layers. She thought about what her father had said about crooked wood catching. She thought about stopping. It would be easier to stop, to admit that Voss was right, that Nell was right, that Milo was right, to take Thomas and walk to Yankton and beg for work, for shelter, for the charity she had sworn she would not accept. It would be easier to give up than to repair these cracks, to add more layers, to keep building something that the weather kept tearing down. The wind gusted. The lean-to canvas snapped. From somewhere downriver, a tree branch cracked and fell. Ada touched the edge of the nearest crack. The clay was cold, but not frozen solid. Not yet. The temperature was dropping, but it had not reached the killing cold that would come later. She could still work. She could still repair. She could still try. She went back to the lean-to for her tools. By morning, she had patched all 3 cracks with fresh clay mixed from the pile she kept covered near the fire. The patches were rough, applied in darkness, barely visible in the gray dawn light. They might hold, they might not. But they were there. She had not stopped. The dome stood against the pale sky, squat and strange, more mound than building. The entry tunnel was still incomplete. The interior was still open. Half the structure was sealed, and half was bare willow mesh waiting for clay that might freeze before it cured. She had 3 weeks until deep winter. 3 weeks to finish the walls, seal the roof, build the entry, line the fire pit, construct the sleeping platform, bank earth around the exterior for insulation. 3 weeks to build what she had originally thought might take 8. Thomas emerged from the lean-to, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He looked at the dome, at the patches of fresh clay, at his mother standing exhausted beside her work. "Did you fix it?" he asked. I fixed it for now. Will it stay fixed? Ada looked at the northern sky where darker clouds were building. The temperature was dropping again. Another test was coming, and she was not ready. I do not know, she said, but I am going to keep trying until I find out. The days after the November storm became a race Ada could feel in her bones. She worked from first light until her hands would no longer grip tools. She cut willow until the riverbank thickets showed bare patches where she had harvested. She mixed clay until her shoulders burned and her fingers cracked from the alkalite in the mud. She wove and sealed and patched and waited for each layer to cure before adding the next. And every time she thought she was gaining ground, the weather reminded her that it was setting the pace. Marta came twice more that week. The first visit, she said nothing about the patches on the north wall. She simply examined them, pressed her palm against the seams, and nodded once. You learned from the failure, she said. That is what matters. I cannot afford more failures. Then do not make them. But if you do, learn again. The second visit, Marta brought something Ada had not expected, a bundle of dried grass woven into flat mats, each one about 2 feet square. What are these for? Ada asked. The inside of your sleeping platform. Brush and reeds trap moisture against your blankets. These let air move beneath you while holding warmth above. Ada took the mats. They were light, flexible, expertly made. Each one must have taken hours to weave. You made these, Ada said. My daughter-in-law made them. I asked her if she could spare a few for a woman building a round house on the river. What did she say? She said anyone foolish enough to try deserves whatever help she can get. It was not praise. It was not even confidence. But it was something. Someone else knew what she was doing. Someone else thought it might be worth helping. The third teaching came on November 10th. Ada had been struggling with the entry tunnel. She understood the principle, a low passage facing away from the prevailing wind, forcing cold air to climb to enter, while warm air pooled at the higher sleeping level. But the construction was different from the dome itself. The tunnel needed straight walls, a low ceiling, a floor that sloped slightly upward toward the interior. She had been building it like a miniature cabin, vertical posts, horizontal boards scavenged from driftwood, a flat roof weighted with sod. It looked crude. It also leaked at every joint. Marta watched her work for nearly an hour before speaking. You are building a box, she said finally. The tunnel needs to be a different shape than the dome. Why? Because Ada stopped. She had no answer. She had assumed the tunnel needed to be rectangular because that was what tunnels looked like in her mind, passages through walls, corridors and buildings, things with flat floors and straight sides. The wind does not care what shape your mind thinks a tunnel should be, Marta said. The wind cares about what it can enter. A box has corners. Corners create eddies. Eddies pull cold air inside. She walked to the partially built tunnel and ran her hand along one of the joints Ada had been trying to seal. A curve has no corners. A curve turns wind aside instead of catching it. Your dome knows this. Your tunnel does not. Ada looked at her construction, the squared-off entrance, the flat roof, the right angles that she now realized were invitation for exactly the drafts she was trying to prevent. I would have to start over, she said. You would have to finish correctly. Starting over is just a phrase people use when they do not want to admit they need to change what they are doing. It took Ada 3 days to rebuild the entry tunnel as a curved passage. She used bent willow arches like the dome itself, smaller in scale, but following the same principle. She wove and sealed and sodded until the entrance was a low throat that swept upward and curved slightly to the right before opening into the interior. When she crawled through it for the first time, She understood what Marta had meant. The wind that had been sneaking through every joint of her squared tunnel now had nowhere to grip. The curve turned it aside. The cold air that entered had to climb to reach the living space. It was not perfect. It was not finished, but it was better. Elias Voss returned on November 15th. He did not dismount this time. He sat on his gray mare at the edge of the work site and studied the dome in silence for a long moment. The structure had changed since his last visit. The frame was complete. 3/4 of the exterior was sealed with layered clay and covered in patchy sod. The entry tunnel curved into the earth like the mouth of a burrow. Smoke rose from a vent hole in the crown where Ada had rigged a temporary cap from hide and bent willow. "You're still here," Voss said. Ada was cutting sod blocks from a section of riverbank turf, using her spade to carve rectangles roughly 2 feet long and 1 foot wide. Each block came up heavy with roots and frozen soil. "I am still here. I heard you had help. I have had some help. The Yankton woman, Marta Red Elk." Ada paused her cutting. "You know her?" "I know of her. She patched smoke caps for the Army twice, years ago when we were running winter freight and our canvas would not hold. She knows things most people have forgotten." He rode closer to the dome. His horse snorted at the strange shape, unfamiliar with structures that rose from the ground instead of standing on top of it. "This is not what I expected," Voss said. "What did you expect?" "Honestly, I expected to find the lean-to collapsed and you gone, or worse." "I am not gone. I can see that." He studied the dome again, the sealed sections, the gaps still waiting for clay, the entry tunnel that dove into shadow, the smoke rising thin and pale against the November sky. "Will it hold?" he asked. "I do not know yet." That is not a comforting answer. It is the only honest one. Voss was quiet. The wind picked up, pushing against the dome's curved surface. Ada watched the structure. It did not sway. It did not creak. The wind slid over it like water over a stone. "Any structure seems sound before a real storm," Voss finally said. "I have seen cabins that looked solid in October collapse in January. I have seen sod houses that held for 5 winters fall in the 6th. I know. Do you? I know that nothing I build will be guaranteed to survive. I know that the only thing guaranteed is that if I build nothing, we die." Voss nodded slowly. Something in his expression shifted. Not approval, not confidence, but perhaps the beginning of respect for someone who understood the math, even if the math did not favor her. "Finish the south wall before the next cold snap," he said. "That is where the sun hits longest. If you can seal that side while there is still warmth in the daylight, the clay will cure faster." It was advice, real advice, not dismissal. "Thank you," Ada said. Voss turned his horse. "Do not thank me yet. Surviving November is not the same as surviving January." He rode away. Ada went back to cutting sod, working faster than before. The first week of December brought the cold she had been dreading. Not the killing cold, not yet, but cold enough that the clay she mixed in the morning froze by afternoon if she did not apply it fast enough. Cold enough that her water bucket developed a skim of ice overnight that had to be broken before she could drink. Cold enough that Thomas's cough, which had faded in late November, came back with a sound that rattled in his chest. She worked through it. She had no choice. The dome was nearly complete. The exterior was sealed on all 4 quarters, layered clay under patchy sod, lumpy and uneven but continuous. The entry tunnel curved properly into the interior. The smoke cap had been rebuilt twice, once when the first version collapsed under snow weight, again when the replacement proved too tight and filled the interior with smoke every time the fire burned hot. The third version worked. A stiffened willow rim held the hide cap open enough for smoke to escape, while a weighted flap could be pulled from inside to close it during heavy wind. It was ugly. It was improvised. It held. The interior took shape more slowly. She dug the floor 6 inches below grade, as Marta had suggested, creating a shallow basin that held warmth better than a flat surface. She lined the fire pit with flat stones scavenged from the riverbank, arranging them in a circle that radiated heat outward. She built the sleeping platform along the rear curve, a raised bed of packed earth covered with brush, then reed matting, then the woven grass mats Marta had brought. Thomas tested the platform by lying on it while Ada worked. "It is warm," he said, surprised. "It will be warmer when the walls are fully sealed." "When will the walls be fully sealed?" "Soon." She did not know if soon was true, but she said it anyway, because her son needed to believe it. Marta came for the last time on December 8th. She brought a bone awl and a spool of sinew thread, tools for repairing hide, for patching the door blanket that would hang across the entry tunnel, for work that required finer hands than Ada's cracked and calloused fingers could manage. "I am leaving after the new moon," Marta said. Ada's hand stopped moving. "Leaving?" "My daughter-in-law's sister needs help upriver. She lost her husband in the fall. She has 3 children and no one to cut wood." "But," Ada stopped herself. She had no right to ask Marta to stay. Marta had already given more than Ada had any reason to expect: weeks of teaching, materials she could have kept for her own family, knowledge that had been passed down through generations and was now being handed to a white widow on a river lot. "You do not need me anymore," Marta said, as if reading her thoughts. "You know how to weave. You know how to layer clay. You know how to build an entry that turns wind. What you do not know, you will learn by doing." "What if I make mistakes?" "You will make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. The question is whether you learn from them fast enough." She handed Ada the bone awl. It was smooth with use, worn into a curve that fit perfectly in the palm. "This was my mother's," Marta said. "She used it to patch lodge covers for 40 winters. It knows more about ceiling gaps than either of us." Ada took the awl. It was warm from Marta's hand. "I do not know how to thank you," she said. "You can thank me by surviving, by teaching your son what you have learned, by remembering that shape is what the wind hears first." Marta looked at the dome one last time. The sealed walls, the curved entry, the smoke rising thin from the cap she had helped design. Something like satisfaction crossed her face, or perhaps it was sadness. Ada could not tell. "It is a good house," Marta said. "Not beautiful, not proud, but good." She walked away without looking back. Ada watched her go until she disappeared into the cottonwoods along the river. Then she turned back to the dome and got to work. There was still so much to finish. By Christmas Day, the structure was complete. Not perfect, nothing built in 2 months from river debris could be perfect, but complete. The walls were sealed, the roof was closed. The entry tunnel curved properly into an interior that could be made dark and warm with a fire the size of 2 fists. The sleeping platform was finished, raised and insulated and covered with everything soft Ada could find. The door was a doubled layer of canvas and hide, weighted at the bottom with stone so it would not lift in the wind. She had moved out of the lean-to in the 2nd week of December, unable to justify maintaining 2 structures when one was nearly habitable. The first night inside the dome, she had lain awake listening to the wind move over the curved roof, a sound completely different from the slapping and cracking of canvas against poles. The dome did not fight the wind. It let the wind pass. Thomas slept better than he had in months. The cough faded. The fever that had threatened in early December never fully developed. The warmth that pooled in the Ray's sleeping area was not hot. It was never hot, but it was survivable. It was more than the lean-to had ever offered. The fuel situation remained dire. Ada had gathered every piece of deadfall and driftwood within a quarter-mile of the site, and her supply was still barely enough for January. The dome burned less wood than the lean-to had. The sealed walls and raised floor meant she could heat the small interior with a fraction of the fuel a drafty structure would require, but a fraction of what she needed was still not enough. She would have to ration. She would have to burn small and wear more layers. She would have to hope the design worked as well in deep cold as it had in merely cold. But for one day, Christmas Day, though she had no way to mark it except counting from the last new moon, she let herself believe it might be enough. The first week of January brought a false thaw. The temperature climbed unexpectedly, rising to nearly 40 degrees for 3 consecutive days. Snow that had accumulated melted into mud. Ice on the river softened. People who had been trapped inside for weeks emerged blinking into sunlight that felt almost warm. Nell Harker came during the thaw. She did not knock. There was nothing to knock on, but she called from outside the entry tunnel, asking permission to enter. Ada crawled out to meet her. Nell looked different than she had in October, thinner, harder around the eyes. 3 months of winter on a marginal homestead had taken their toll. "I came to see if you survived," Nell said. "We survived so far." "May I look inside?" Ada led her through the entry tunnel. Nell had to duck low. The passage was built for keeping heat in, not for comfortable walking, and she emerged into the dome interior with an expression of surprise she could not quite hide. "It is warm," she said. "Warmer than outside. Much warmer than outside." She walked the small perimeter, touching the sealed walls, examining the fire pit, looking up at the curved roof where daylight filtered through the smoke cap. The dome was dark, no windows, no glass, but it was not cave dark. It was the dimness of a protected space, a shelter against everything outside. "You built this," Nell said, "from the river." "From the river, and from what Marta taught me." "The Yankton woman." "Yes." Nell was quiet for a long moment. Thomas watched from the sleeping platform, wrapped in blankets, following the conversation with wide eyes. "I owe you an apology," Nell finally said. "You do not—" "I do. I said wet clay freezes before it cures. I said you did not have time for layers. I was trying to help, but I was also trying to convince you to stop before you failed." "I know. You built it anyway. I did not have another choice." Nell nodded slowly. She looked at the walls again, the uneven surface, the visible seams between clay layers, the patches where repairs had been made after cracks formed and were sealed. "It is not pretty," she said. "No, but it works." "So far." Nell reached into her coat and pulled out a small package wrapped in cloth. "Dried apples, from our store. We have more than we need." Ada took the package. It was the first gift anyone had given her since Marta's bone-all. "Thank you," she said. "Do not thank me yet. January has not truly begun." She crawled back out through the entry tunnel and walked away across the muddy ground. Ada watched her go, then returned inside and gave Thomas a dried apple slice that made him smile for the first time in weeks. The false thaw ended on January 11th. Ada woke that morning to a quality of light she had learned to recognize, the pale, flat brightness that came before a serious weather change. The air felt different too, heavier, charged with something she could not name but could feel pressing against her skin. She went outside and looked at the sky. Clouds were building from the northwest, not the thin, fast-moving clouds of ordinary winter, but a solid wall of gray that seemed to swallow the horizon. Marta had told her once about reading weather. "The sky tells you what is coming," she had said. The question is whether you listen. Ada listened now. She did not like what she heard. She spent the day preparing. She brought extra driftwood into the interior, stacking it near the fire pit where it would stay dry. She checked every seam of the entry tunnel, pressing clay into gaps she had missed. She weighted the door blanket with additional stones. She filled every container she had with water from the river, knowing that if the temperature dropped far enough, she would not want to go outside for days. Thomas watched her work with growing anxiety. "Is a storm coming?" he asked. "Maybe." "A bad storm?" "I do not know yet, but we will be ready if it is." By evening, the clouds had covered the entire sky. The temperature had begun to drop, not dramatically, not yet, but steadily. The false thaw was over. Winter had remembered what it was supposed to do. Ada went to sleep that night with the fire banked low to conserve fuel. She did not expect to sleep well. She did not. January 12th, 1888. Ada woke to a morning that felt wrong. The air inside the dome was warmer than it should have been, warm enough that condensation had formed on the walls near the smoke cap. Outside, she could hear nothing. No wind, no birds, no sound of any kind. Just silence. She crawled through the entry tunnel and stood up into a world transformed. The temperature had climbed during the night, not to thaw levels, but to something milder than the previous week. The sky was overcast, but not threatening. The ground was soft enough that her boots left prints. For a moment, she thought the storm had passed without arriving. Then she looked northwest. The wall of cloud she had seen the day before had not dissipated. It had consolidated. It hung on the horizon like a bruise, darker and denser than anything she had seen since arriving on the river. Even as she watched, she could see it growing, not moving toward her, but expanding, filling more and more of the sky. And there was something else, a sound at the edge of hearing. Not wind, not yet. More like pressure, like the air itself was being compressed by something she could not see. She went back inside. "Thomas," she said, keeping her voice calm, "I need you to stay inside today. Do not go outside for any reason. Do you understand?" He nodded, eyes wide. "We're going to be fine. The house will keep us warm. But you need to stay inside." She built the fire up higher than usual, sacrificing fuel economy for immediate heat. She closed the smoke cap to a narrow slit, just enough to let smoke escape. She hung an additional blanket across the entry tunnel, creating a second barrier against whatever was coming. Then she waited. The storm hit at 11 o'clock in the morning. There was no gradual onset, no slow building of wind and snow. One moment the air was still. The next, the world outside the entry tunnel had disappeared. Ada had seen blizzards before. She had lived through hard winters in Sioux City, had watched storms pile snow against buildings, and shut down the ferry crossing for days at a time. She thought she knew what a blizzard sounded like. She was wrong. This was not sound. This was a physical force, a weight of wind and frozen air that pressed against the dome like a hand trying to crush an egg. The curved walls did not shake. They had nothing flat for the wind to catch, but Ada could feel the pressure, could sense the atmosphere outside her shelter being torn apart by something she could not see. The temperature inside the dome dropped 10 degrees in the first hour, then another 5, then another. She fed the fire. She kept Thomas wrapped in every blanket they had. She listened to the sound of the world ending outside her walls and tried to calculate how long they could survive. The first complication came at 1 o'clock. Someone was shouting outside. At first, Ada thought she was imagining it. The wind was so loud, so constant, that any human sound should have been swallowed immediately. But the shouting continued, and it was coming from the direction of the entry tunnel. She crawled toward the entrance, pushing past the weighted blankets. The The cold hit her like a fist. She could not see anything beyond the first 3 feet of the tunnel. Everything past that was white, howling, formless. "Hello?" she called. The shouting again, closer now. Then a shape in the whiteness, barely human, staggering toward the tunnel entrance. Ada grabbed the shape and pulled. It was Nell Harker. Her face was white with frost. Her hands were shaking so badly she could not grip anything. In her arms she carried her youngest daughter, a girl of 4 whose eyes were closed and whose skin was the wrong color. She was outside, Nell gasped, playing in the false warmth. I could not find her when it hit. I could not. Inside, Ada said. Now. She dragged Nell through the tunnel and into the dome. The warmth hit them like a wave, and Nell's legs gave out. She collapsed on the packed earth floor, still clutching her daughter. Ada took the girl from Nell's arms. The child was breathing, but barely. Her hands were blue. Her lips were gray. She had been in the storm for perhaps 20 minutes, long enough for the cold to begin shutting down everything that made her alive. Thomas started to cry. "Thomas," Ada said, her voice sharper than she intended. "I need you to be quiet. I need you to get the blankets from the sleeping platform, all of them, now." He moved. Ada stripped the frozen mittens from the girl's hands. The skin beneath was white and waxy, frostbite, already setting in. She pulled the child close to her own body, sharing heat, feeling how cold the small frame was against her chest. Nell was trying to stand, failing, trying again. "Stay down," Ada said. "You are no good to her if you fall and hurt yourself." "My daughter is alive. She will stay alive if you let me work." Thomas returned with the blankets. Ada wrapped the girl in layers, then laid her on the sleeping platform and covered her with everything soft in the dome. The fire needed more fuel. The smoke cap was starting to ice over. The wind outside had not decreased. If anything, it had grown stronger. She could not do everything at once. "Nell," Ada said, "can you feed the fire?" Nell looked at her with eyes that were not quite focusing. Shock, probably, cold and fear, and the near loss of a child combining into something that made thinking difficult. "Nell, the fire. Put wood on it, small pieces. Not too many at once." Nell nodded slowly. She crawled toward the fire pit, her movements clumsy but purposeful. Ada turned back to the girl. The child's breathing was steadier now, though still too shallow. Her hands were warming. Ada could feel the blood returning to the fingers, which meant the frostbite was not as deep as she had feared. But they were not safe. They were 4 people in a shelter built for 2, burning fuel at twice the rate Ada had planned, with a storm outside that showed no signs of stopping, and the smoke cap was icing over. She noticed it 20 minutes later. The dome was filling with smoke, not the thin managed haze of a properly vented fire, but a thickening cloud that made her eyes water and her lungs burn. The cap had frozen shut. Snow had packed into the vent opening and formed a seal that no smoke could penetrate. The fire was killing them as surely as the cold would. "I have to go outside," Ada said. Nell looked up from the fire pit. "You cannot. You will die. If I do not clear the vent, we will die in here. The smoke will take us before the cold does." She did not wait for an argument. She crawled to the entry tunnel and pushed through the weighted blankets, gasping as the cold hit her again. The whiteness outside was absolute. She could not see the sky, the ground, the river, anything beyond the immediate entrance to the tunnel. But she knew where the vent was. She had built this structure. She knew every curve of the roof, every angle of the crown. She climbed. The dome's exterior was slick with ice and packed snow. Her hands numbed almost immediately. The wind tried to tear her loose, tried to peel her from the surface like bark from a tree. She held on through grip strength she did not know she had and pulled herself up toward the crown. The vent was there, exactly where she knew it would be, a dark circle packed solid with ice and frozen snow. She could not see her hands in front of her face, but she could feel the vent rim, could locate the ice that was blocking it. She did not have a tool. She had not thought to bring one. She used her fist. The ice cracked on the third blow. On the fifth, a chunk broke loose and disappeared into the howling white. On the eighth, the blockage gave way, and she felt warm smoke rush past her face, escaping into the storm. Getting down was harder than getting up. The wind had shifted, was now hitting the dome from a different angle, and Ada had lost her sense of direction. She slid more than climbed, feeling her way along the curve of the roof until her feet found the ground. The entry tunnel was somewhere nearby. It had to be. She had built it facing southeast, away from the northwest wind, which meant she could not think. The cold was taking her thoughts, freezing them mid-formation. She staggered in what she hoped was the right direction and nearly fell into the tunnel entrance, a darker shadow in the universal white. Inside, crawl, push through the blankets. The warmth of the dome hit her like an embrace. She collapsed on the packed earth floor, shaking so hard she could not control her limbs. Nell was there, pulling her toward the fire, stripping off her frozen outer layers. "You are alive," Nell said. "You went outside in that, and you are alive." Ada could not answer. Her jaw was locked. Her fingers would not move. But she could see the smoke rising properly now, escaping through the cleared vent, and she could breathe without coughing. The fire burned on. If you're invested in this story, hit subscribe and stay with us, because the next few hours decide whether any of them see daylight. The worst of the storm came in the late afternoon. Ada had recovered enough to sit up, to think, to count the fuel remaining and calculate how long it might last. The answer was not encouraging. 4 people meant 4 bodies generating heat, but it also meant 4 bodies consuming oxygen and 4 mouths that would eventually need water and food. She had brought extra wood inside before the storm, but not enough for this. Not enough for days. The temperature inside the dome had stabilized at something survivable, cold enough that breath still fogged, but warm enough that exposed skin did not freeze. The curved walls were holding. The wind rolled over the roof instead of battering against it. The entry tunnel forced cold air to climb before it could reach the living space. Everything Marta had taught her was working. Everything she had built was holding, but the storm was not stopping. At 4 o'clock, someone else arrived. The shouting came from outside again, weaker this time, barely audible over the wind. Ada crawled to the tunnel entrance, expecting another neighbor, another desperate person seeking shelter. It was Elias Voss. He was half frozen, ice in his beard, one hand tucked under his arm like he was trying to protect it. He staggered through the tunnel and collapsed inside the dome without speaking. "Voss," Ada said. "What happened?" He looked up at her with eyes that had seen too much in the past few hours. "My west wall opened," he said. "The chinking failed. I could not seal it. The temperature—" He stopped, shook his head. 40 degrees, maybe 50, in hours. I have never seen anything like it. "Where is your horse?" "Gone. I do not know where. The wind took the barn door and the horse bolted. I walked here because I could not think of anywhere else to go." Ada looked at the man who had told her this structure would fail. The man who had said she was building a grave mound. The man who had predicted her son would freeze before dawn. He was sitting in her dome, alive because the walls she built were still standing while his had failed. She handed him a blanket. "Stay by the fire," she said. "Do not move until you can feel your hands again." He took the blanket. His face showed something she had never seen there before. Not gratitude, not yet, but the beginning of a different kind of understanding. The night was endless. 5 people now, packed into a space built for 2. The fire burned constantly, fed by hands that took turns so no one person exhausted themselves. The smoke cap had to be cleared twice more. Ada went each time, unwilling to risk anyone else on the icy roof in the dark, and each trip outside took something from her that she was not sure she could replace. Thomas slept fitfully, curled against the rear wall of the sleeping platform. Nell's daughter had regained consciousness by evening, though she was still too weak to move. Nell stayed beside her, whispering things Ada could not hear. Voss sat with his back against the curved wall, feeding wood to the fire with mechanical precision, saying nothing. At midnight, the wind changed. Ada felt it before she heard it, a shift in the pressure against the dome, a different quality to the sound. The storm was not ending, but it was evolving, moving through phases she did not fully understand. By 2 in the morning, the temperature outside had dropped even further. Ada could feel it through the walls, a cold so deep it seemed to have weight, to press against the sealed clay like something trying to get in. The fire pit was running low. They had perhaps 3 hours of wood remaining at current burn rates. "We need to burn less," Ada said. Voss looked up. "We burn less. The temperature drops. It is already barely above freezing in here. If we burn what we have left now, we have nothing for morning. We do not know how long this lasts. If we freeze before morning, it does not matter how long it lasts." He was right. She knew he was right. But she also knew the arithmetic of fuel and time, and the numbers did not work. "Smaller pieces," she said. "Hotter burn, less total fuel. We compress the heat into shorter intervals. Let the dome's mass hold the warmth between burns. That is not how heating works. It is how this dome works. The walls are thick. They absorb heat during the fire and release it slowly after. I have been testing it for weeks. Short, hot burns followed by banking the coals. The interior stays warmer longer than a constant small flame." Voss stared at her. Then he looked at the walls around him, the layered clay, the sawed exterior, the curved shape that had been mocked as primitive and strange. "You know this building," he said. It was not quite a question. "I built this building." He nodded slowly. Then he reached for a piece of driftwood and began breaking it into smaller pieces. Dawn came gray and howling. The storm had not stopped. If anything, the wind had increased, but the light filtering through the smoke cap, dim, gray, barely distinguishable from the darkness of night, told Ada that time was still passing. They had made it through the night. The fire was down to coals and a few scraps of bark. The dome's interior had cooled to something uncomfortable but survivable. Everyone was awake, huddled in blankets, watching the smoke cap like it might tell them something about when the world would return. At 8 o'clock, the wind began to fade. At 9, Ada could see shapes outside the entry tunnel for the first time in 20 hours. At 10, she crawled outside and stood up into a world that had been remade. Snow had drifted to the level of her chest in places. The dome rose from the drifts like a burial mound, like something that had grown there, like nothing anyone would recognize as a house. The trees along the river were plastered white. The sky was clearing, blue appearing in patches between the retreating clouds. The temperature was still dangerously cold, but the storm was over. Ada stood in the snow and breathed air that did not try to kill her. Behind her, one by one, the others emerged from the tunnel. Nell carrying her daughter. Voss moving slowly, his frostbitten hand still tucked protectively against his chest. Thomas, wide-eyed, staring at a landscape that looked nothing like the one he remembered. The dome had held. The walls Ada had built from driftwood and river clay. The walls everyone had called a beaver pile. The walls that were supposed to collapse by morning, they were still standing. They had made it. The full scope of the storm became clear over the following days. 40 degrees. The temperature had dropped 40 degrees in less than 8 hours on the morning of January 12th. Across the northern plains, people who had been caught outside when the blizzard hit had frozen within minutes. Children walking home from school had died within sight of their doors. Cattle had frozen standing upright, buried by drifts that reached their shoulders. They were calling it the worst storm in territorial memory. Some were calling it the school children's blizzard because of how many young people it had killed, caught outside during the false thaw, caught between home and school when the wall of cold descended without warning. On Ada's stretch of the river, the dome had been the only structure that held its heat through the night. Voss's cabin had lost its west wall to wind pressure and inadequate chinking. He had survived only because he had left to seek better shelter before his own home became his grave. A bachelor settler 2 miles south had been found 3 days later, frozen in his shack. The draft had backsmoked his fire so many times that he had let it go out rather than fill his lungs with poison. He had died in his blankets, trying to outlast the cold through will alone. Nell's husband had weathered the storm in their cabin, but barely. The structure had leaked at every seam, and he had burned through a week's worth of fuel in a single night trying to keep the interior above freezing. The dome had burned less than a third of what Nell's cabin had. It had held its heat with 5 people inside instead of 2. It had kept everyone alive through a storm that killed hundreds across the territory. It was not beautiful. It was not proud. It did not look like what a house was supposed to look like, but it had worked. The days after the storm brought visitors. They came singly at first, then in pairs, then in small groups that had to wait outside the entry tunnel because the dome could not hold more than a few people at once. They came from claims up and down the river, settlers who had heard about the widow's strange house, the one that had sheltered 5 people through the worst night anyone could remember. They came to see if the stories were true. Ada showed them everything. She had no reason to hide what she had built and no desire to protect knowledge that might save someone else's life. She walked them around the exterior, pointing out the layered clay, the sod covering, the curved shape that let wind pass instead of catching it. She took them through the entry tunnel, explaining how the low throat and the southeast orientation kept cold air from flooding the interior. She showed them the fire pit, the sleeping platform, the smoke cap with its weighted flap. Most of them did not understand what they were seeing. They looked at the dome and saw something primitive, something that belonged to a different people in a different time. They nodded politely and went home to their square cabins with their flat roofs and their walls that leaked at every chinking seam. But some of them understood. A widow named Clara Ebson, 63 years old, living alone on a quarter section 4 miles east, stayed for 2 hours asking questions. She had nearly died in the storm. Her fire had gone out twice, and she had spent the night huddled in blankets, waiting for morning or death, whichever came first. She wanted to know if she could build something like this. She wanted to know if Ada would teach her. Ada said yes. Elias Voss returned on the 3rd day after the storm. His hand was bandaged now. Frostbite had taken the tips of 2 fingers, and the rest would take months to heal fully. His cabin was being repaired by neighbors who had organized a work party, but the repairs were temporary. The west wall would need to be completely rebuilt before next winter. He did not come to ask for help. He came to say something he had never said before. "I told you your boy would freeze before dawn," he said. They were standing outside the dome, in snow that had been packed down by the feet of visitors. The temperature was cold but bearable, nothing like the killing cold of January 12th. Ada was holding a cup of weak tea that was already going lukewarm in her hands. "I remember," she said. "I was wrong." The words hung in the air between them. Voss was not a man who admitted error easily. 21 winters on the northern plains had taught him to trust his own judgment because trusting anything else could kill you. You had reason to think what you thought, Ada said. You had seen people die from structures like mine. I had seen people die from structures that looked like yours. I had not seen a structure like yours actually built. He gestured at the dome. I told you there was only one way to survive, the way that works and the way that kills you. I said cabins work. I said sod houses work. I did not say this could work because I did not believe it could. And now? Voss looked at the dome for a long moment. The snow had drifted halfway up the walls, making the structure look even more like a natural formation, something that had grown from the earth rather than been built on top of it. Now I have been inside it during the worst storm of my life, he said. Now I have felt the heat it holds with a fire smaller than my fist. Now I have watched it stand while my own cabin failed. He met her eyes. I was wrong. I told you your boy would freeze, and I was wrong. Ada did not know what to say. She had imagined this moment, the authority who had dismissed her admitting that she had been right, but the reality of it felt different than she had expected. There was no triumph in it. There was only the knowledge that they had both survived something that had killed so many others. Would you like more tea? She asked. Voss almost smiled. I would like to understand how you built the entry tunnel. I have been thinking about it for 3 days, and I cannot figure out how you got the curve to hold without a frame. Ada led him back toward the dome. I will show you. It is not as complicated as it looks. Nell Harker's conversion came in stages. The first stage was gratitude, simple, uncomplicated thankfulness that Ada had opened her home to a desperate woman carrying a dying child. Nell said the words once, on the day after the storm, and did not repeat them. She was not a woman who expressed emotion through repetition. The second stage was curiosity. Nell came back a week after the storm, this time alone, and asked to see the construction in detail. She walked the perimeter 3 times. She measured the wall thickness with her hands. She crawled through the entry tunnel and sat inside the dome for nearly an hour, watching the way heat moved through the space. The fire is small, she said. Smaller than yours? Much smaller, but the room is warmer. She looked at the curved walls, the packed earth floor, the raised sleeping platform. How is that possible? Ada explained what Marta had taught her, the layered clay that sealed gaps, the earth mass that absorbed and released heat slowly, the curved shape that had no corners for cold air to pool in. She explained the entry tunnel, the smoke cap, the sleeping platform raised above the coldest air. Nell listened without interrupting. When Ada finished, she sat in silence for a long moment. I owe you more than an apology, she finally said. You owe me nothing. I told you wet clay freezes before it cures. I told you that you did not have time. I was trying to convince you to fail before you failed. You were trying to protect me from false hope. I was trying to protect myself from watching you die. Nell's voice was harder now, more honest. I did not want to see a woman and child starve on the riverbank because I had not stopped them from trying something foolish. I wanted you to leave so I would not have to witness what happened if you stayed. But I stayed. You stayed. And you survived. And when my daughter was dying in the snow, you were the only person on this stretch of river with a structure that could save her. Nell stood. She walked to the entry tunnel and looked back at Ada. Oh, teach me, she said. Not the whole thing. I do not have time to build a dome before next winter. But teach me the entry. Teach me how to curve the tunnel so cold air has to climb. Teach me how to seal the gaps the way you seal them. I will teach you everything I know. Then I will come back tomorrow with a shovel. She crawled out through the tunnel, and Ada heard her boots crunching through the snow toward home. The third stage was adoption. Nell returned the next day, and the day after, and the day after that. She learned to weave willow around bent stakes. She learned to layer clay in thin coats, letting each one cure before adding the next. She learned to test seals by holding a candle flame near every joint and watching for flicker. By the end of February, she had rebuilt her cabin's entry as a curved tunnel. It was crude compared to Ada's. The walls were uneven, the curve was too sharp in places, but it worked. When the next cold snap came, Nell's cabin held its heat for the first time since she had moved into it. She told her neighbors. Her neighbors told their neighbors. By March, Ada had visited 6 different claims to assess entry tunnels, seal failures, and draft problems. She did not charge money. She had none to begin with, and asking for payment felt wrong when people were simply trying to survive. She accepted food when it was offered, accepted labor when someone volunteered to help stack her dwindling firewood supply. She accepted the respect that came with being the woman who had built something that worked when everything else failed. It was not fame, it was not wealth, but it was something she had not had since her husband died. A place in the community that was hers, that she had earned, that no one could take away. Milo Marin heard the stories. He could not avoid them. Everyone on the river was talking about the Widow's Dome, the structure that had sheltered 5 people through the blizzard, the strange round house that burned half the fuel and held twice the heat. His own neighbors were asking about curved entry tunnels and layered clay ceiling, techniques that had come from the woman he had cast off his brother's land. He responded the way Ada had expected him to respond, with dismissal. "Luck," he said to anyone who would listen. "She got lucky. One storm does not prove anything. Next winter that mud pile will collapse like every other mud pile, and then we will see who was right." But the dismissal rang hollow now. People had seen the dome. People had been inside it. People had watched Elias Voss, a man who had survived 21 winters, admit publicly that he had been wrong about the structure. Milo's authority was built on being the practical one, the sensible one, the man who made hard decisions because someone had to. Casting Ada off the family claim had been one of those hard decisions. He had told himself it was necessary, that there was no way for a widow and child to survive on worthless river ground, that taking the wagon and team was simply reclaiming what was rightfully his. Now the widow had survived. Now the worthless ground had produced something that worked better than his own cabin. Now the hard decision looked less like practicality and more like cruelty. He did not come to see the dome. He did not ask Ada to teach him anything. He stayed on his claim 2 miles east and waited for the structure to fail, for the spring floods to wash it away, for something to happen that would prove he had been right all along. But spring came, and the dome did not fail, and Milo's position grew harder to defend with every passing week. Marta Red Elk returned in April. The structure had weathered the winter well, some clay cracking that would need repair, some sod displacement on the south side, but nothing structural. "You survived. We survived. Thomas and I, and Nell Harker and her daughter, and Elias Voss. I heard. The whole river heard. The widow's dome that held 5 people through the worst storm in memory. It was your dome as much as mine. You taught me everything. I taught you how to build. You chose to build when everyone said you should not." Marta walked closer to the structure, running her hand along the sealed wall the way she had done when she first started teaching Ada. "You made choices I did not teach you. The entry curve is sharper than I would have made it. The smoke cap is weighted differently. These were your decisions. Were they wrong? They worked. That makes them right. Marta stayed for 3 days. She helped Ada repair the winter damage, patching clay, resetting sod, reinforcing the entry tunnel where spring water had begun to undercut one edge. They worked in near silence, the way Ada had learned to work with her, communicating through gesture and demonstration rather than speech. On the second day, Marta told her about the woman upriver, the one she had gone to help in December. The woman had survived the blizzard in a conventional cabin, but barely. 2 of her 3 children had developed chest sickness from the cold. One had died in February. She asked me to build her a round house, Marta said. I told her I could not stay long enough. I told her to find Ada Marin on the river south of Yankton. Did she come? She will come when she can travel with children. Maybe May, maybe June. Ada felt something shift in her chest, a weight she had not known she was carrying. The knowledge she had learned was not going to die with her. It was going to spread, to grow, to become something larger than one woman on one claim. I will teach her, Ada said. I will teach anyone who wants to learn. Marta nodded. That is why I came back, to see if you would say that. On the 3rd day, they built something new together. Ada had been thinking about the fuel problem since January. The dome burned less than a conventional cabin, but it still burned fuel, and gathering enough driftwood and deadfall to last a winter was work that consumed weeks of time. She wanted to find a way to store wood more efficiently, to keep it dry during rain and snow, to have it ready at hand instead of stacked in piles that rotted from the bottom up. A wood cache, she said, explaining the idea to Marta, built against the lee side of the dome, using the dome's shape to shed wind and rain, connected to the entry tunnel so I can reach fuel without going outside in a storm. Marta listened. Then she began to draw in the dirt with a stick, a curved extension off the main dome, lower than the living space, opening into the entry tunnel just before the interior threshold. Like a second room, Marta said, but for wood, not people. Yes. The curve follows the main curve. The roof sheds into the same drainage. The entry is low so heat does not escape into the cache. Yes? Marta looked at the drawing, then at Ada. Something passed between them, not quite approval, not quite pride, but recognition. The recognition of one builder seeing another builder's mind at work. This is not something I taught you, Marta said. This is something you showed me how to think about. They built it together over the following week. It was smaller than the main dome, barely large enough to hold a full cord of wood, but it followed the same principles. Bent willow frame, layered clay seal, sod exterior, a low opening that connected to the entry tunnel, allowing Ada to retrieve fuel without ever stepping outside. When it was finished, they stood back and looked at the combined structure, the dome with its curved roof and its earth-covered walls. The wood cache tucked against its side like a smaller animal sheltering beside a larger one. The entry tunnel curving between them, connecting interior to exterior through a passage that turned wind aside. It looks like something alive, Thomas said. He had been watching the construction with the fascination of a child who was beginning to understand that the world could be shaped by human hands. It is alive, Marta said, as long as someone lives in it, as long as someone maintains it, as long as someone remembers how it was built. She left the next morning. Ada watched her walk north along the river, the same direction she had come from, until she disappeared into the cottonwoods. She did not know that she would never see Marta again. The spring floods came in late May. The Missouri rose 12 feet in 3 days, swollen with snowmelt from mountains Ada had never seen. The water spread across the bottomland, turning solid ground into marsh, lifting driftwood from where it had lodged for years and carrying it downstream to lodge somewhere new. Ada's claim was above the flood line, barely. The dome sat on the slight rise at the back of the lot, the ground Milo had dismissed as too root-tangled to be worth claiming. The roots had saved her. They anchored the soil, held it against the water's pull, kept the bank from eroding the way banks upstream and downstream were eroding. But two families who had built near the river, families who had adopted curved entries and clay ceiling after the January blizzard, lost their improvements to the flood. The water rose into their structures, saturated the clay, dissolved weeks of careful work and hours of muddy current. They came to Ada for help. She went to the first site on a borrowed horse, riding through knee-deep water to reach a claim where a young couple was trying to salvage what remained of their partially rebuilt entry tunnel. The wife was crying. The husband was standing in the ruins of his work, looking like a man who had just learned that survival required more than copying what someone else had done. "You built too close to the water," Ada said. The husband looked up. "You built on the river, too." "I built on the rise. I built where the roots were thickest. I built where my brother-in-law said the ground was worthless because no one could plow it." "We do not have a rise. We have flat ground." "Then you build differently. You do not copy what I built. You look at what you have and build what your ground needs." It was something Marta would have said. Ada heard the words coming out of her mouth and recognized them as the same kind of teaching Marta had given her, not instructions, but principles. Not blueprints, but ways of thinking. She spent 3 days at the first site and 4 at the second, helping rebuild not what had been lost, but what should have been built in the first place. Higher ground, better drainage, foundations that accounted for what the spring river would do instead of assuming it would behave like the winter river. When she returned to her own claim, Thomas ran to meet her at the edge of the property. "A letter came," he said. "A man brought it from Yankton." The letter was from Marta's daughter-in-law. Ada read it standing in the late afternoon light, her boots still muddy from the flood work. Marta had died on April 29th. She had not been sick. She had simply sat down one evening to rest and had not woken the next morning. She had been buried on her family's ground-up river in the way her people buried their dead, with the things she had used in life placed beside her. Ada stood holding the letter for a long time. Thomas watched her, not understanding what the words meant, but understanding that something had changed. "The woman who taught me how to build," Ada finally said. "She died." "The one who showed you the willow?" "Yes." "I am sorry, Mama." Ada folded the letter and put it in her pocket. She looked at the dome, at the wood cache, at the entry tunnel that curved the way Marta had taught her to curve it. Everything around her was built from knowledge that had been passed down, from lessons that had been taught by hands that would never teach again. She thought about what Marta had said the last time they spoke. As long as someone lives in it, as long as someone maintains it, as long as someone remembers how it was built, she would remember. She would teach. She would make sure the knowledge survived even though the teacher was gone. The shape is what the wind hears first. Ada thought about those words often in the weeks after Marta's death. They were the closest thing to a final message she had, words spoken during their last collaboration when they were building the wood cache and Marta was explaining why the curve had to follow a particular arc. Shape is what the wind hears first. Before the wind tests your walls, before it probes your seams, before it finds the gaps you did not seal, it hears the shape. A flat wall tells the wind to push. A peaked roof tells the wind to lift. A curved surface tells the wind to pass. It was not poetry. It was physics, described in language that anyone could understand. It was the kind of knowledge that died when no one taught it, that disappeared when the people who carried it stopped passing it on. Ada began to write things down. She had paper, a small supply she had purchased in Yankton before the storm, and a pencil that Thomas was supposed to use for learning his letters. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, she sat by the fire and wrote what she remembered. She wrote about the root frame, how to select pieces that hook together instead of pulling apart. She wrote about the willow weave, how to soak in heat and bend without splitting. She wrote about the clay, the layers, the curing time between coats. She wrote about the entry tunnel, the smoke cap, the sleeping platform, the wood cache. She wrote about Marta. Not everything. She did not know everything but what she knew. The Yankton widow who patched lodge covers. The woman who recognized something in a desperate settler that others had dismissed. The teacher who gave her knowledge freely because she wanted the knowledge to survive more than she wanted credit for carrying it. Thomas asked what she was writing. Instructions, Ada said, so other people can learn what I learned. Can I read them? When you are older, when you can understand what they mean. Will you teach me what they mean? Ada looked at her son, 7 years old now, still thin from the winter, but stronger than he had been in the fall. He had survived. He was surviving. He would grow up knowing things that most children on the frontier never learned. Yes, she said, I will teach you everything. If the story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Summer brought a visitor Ada did not expect. She was mixing clay for a repair patch when she heard hoofbeats on the trail from the east. She looked up, expecting another neighbor, another seeker of advice. It was Milo. He rode alone. No witnesses this time, no neighbors to observe the encounter. He stopped his horse at the edge of her claim and sat looking at the dome for a long moment before dismounting. Ada did not speak. She had nothing to say to the man who had taken her wagon, her team, her half-built cabin, and left her to die on ground he called worthless. I did not think you would survive, Milo said. I know. I thought. He stopped. Started again. I thought I was being practical. I thought I was doing what had to be done. The debt was real. The tools were bought with my money. The claim was yours, but the means to work it were mine. I remember what you thought. I did not expect you to stay. I expected you to leave, to go back to Sioux City to find family, to do what any sensible person would do when they were beaten. I was not beaten. I was abandoned. Milo flinched. It was a small movement, quickly controlled, but Ada saw it. I came to ask. He stopped again, looked at the dome, looked at the wood cache, looked at the entry tunnel that curved into the earth like something that belonged there. What did you come to ask? I came to ask how you built the entry. My cabin drafts badly. The west wall was rebuilt, but the chinking does not hold. The door lets in cold that the fire cannot push back. He met her eyes. I need to learn what you learned. Ada set down her clay and wiped her hands on her apron. She had imagined this moment too, Milo coming to ask for help, the man who had cast her out now needing what she knew. In her imagination, she had refused him. She had told him to find his own way, to suffer the way she had suffered, to learn through desperation the way she had learned. But standing here now, looking at the man who had taken everything from her and given her the one piece of ground that had saved her life, she found she did not have the energy for revenge. Show me your hands, she said. Milo held them out. They were workers' hands, calloused, scarred, capable, not the hands of a man who had never labored. Can you weave willow? I've never tried. Can you mix clay? I know how mud works. Mud is not clay. Clay requires patience. Clay requires layers. Clay requires waiting when you want to rush. She looked at him steadily. Can you wait? I can learn to wait. Ada did not know if he could. She did not know if he was capable of the kind of humility that building from the river required. But she thought about Marta, about knowledge that died when it was not passed on, about the difference between revenge and survival. "Come back tomorrow," she said. "Bring a shovel. Wear clothes you do not mind ruining." "You will teach me?" "I will show you how to start. Whether you learn anything is up to you." Milo nodded. He mounted his horse and rode away without looking back. Ada watched him go, then returned to her clay. She did not know if he would come back. She did not know if he would learn. But she had made the offer, had extended the knowledge even to the man who had tried to take everything from her. That was what Marta would have done. That was what the knowledge required. Milo came back the next day. He came with a shovel, as instructed. He came in old clothes, as instructed. He came with an expression on his face that Ada recognized, the expression of a man who was about to do something he had never imagined doing, something that violated every assumption he had about how the world worked. She put him to work digging clay from the cut bank. It was hard labor, harder than he expected, harder than most settlers understood until they tried it. The clay was dense and sticky. It clung to the shovel. It weighted every load until his arms burned and his back ached. "This is what you did?" he asked after 2 hours. "For weeks?" "For weeks, alone, while people told me I was building a grave." He said nothing more. He kept digging. By evening, he had enough clay to begin the first layer of a curved entry section, a small test piece, not connected to any structure, just a demonstration of the technique. Ada showed him how to mix the clay with chopped grass, how to apply it in thin coats, how to press it into the willow weave so it bonded instead of sliding off. "It looks simple," he said. "It is simple. It is also slow. And the slowness is part of what makes it work." She could see him struggling with that. Milo was a man who valued efficiency, who measured success by how much could be accomplished in how little time. The idea that slowness could be a strength, that patience could be a building technique, ran against everything he believed. "Why does it have to be thin?" he asked. "Because thick clay cracks when it dries. The outside hardens faster than the inside. The tension splits the surface." "Then why not just let it crack and fill the cracks afterward?" "Because cracks that reach through the full thickness cannot be filled. They become channels for wind. They become entry points for water." Ada touched the test section he had built. "A wall is only as strong as its weakest seam. Thin layers leave fewer seams. Fewer seams mean fewer failures." Milo looked at the small patch of clay he had applied. It was rough, uneven, nothing like the smooth surfaces Ada had learned to create. But it was there. It was a start. "How long before this cures?" he asked. 2 days if the weather holds. Then you add another layer. Then another 2 days. Then another layer." "That is—" He stopped himself. "Slow. Yes. That is why I said you need to learn patience." He left that evening without saying thank you. Ada did not expect thanks. She expected him to return or not return, to learn or not learn, to become someone who understood what the river could teach, or to remain the man who had cast her off the claim. The choice was his. She had done what the knowledge required. The second winter was easier than the first. Not easy. Nothing on the northern plains was easy, but easier. The dome was complete and tested. The wood cache was stocked with fuel gathered throughout the summer and fall. The entry tunnel had been reinforced, the smoke cap redesigned, every lesson from the January blizzard incorporated into improvements that made the structure stronger. Ada and Thomas moved into the dome in October, the same month they had arrived on the claim the year before. But this October felt different. This October, she was not scrambling to build something before the cold killed them. This October, she was maintaining something that already worked. Neighbors came for advice throughout the fall. 7 families had adopted some version of her techniques: curved entries, layered clay, improved smoke venting. Not full domes, not yet, but elements that made their conventional structures more survivable. She taught anyone who asked. She shared everything she knew. She wrote more pages of instructions, more diagrams, more explanations of principles that Marta had taught her. And when winter came, the dome held heat the way it had the year before. The fuel lasted longer than she expected. Thomas stopped coughing in December instead of starting. They were going to survive. The woman from upriver arrived in June of 1889. Her name was Ingeborg Dalby. She was 34 years old, widowed since the previous fall, mother of 3 children who had survived the winter in a cabin that nearly killed them. Her youngest son had died in February from chest sickness brought on by cold, just as Marta had described. She had walked 12 miles with her surviving children to find the woman who built round houses from river debris. Ada met her at the edge of the claim. Ingeborg was thin, worn, carrying a child on her hip and leading another by the hand. The third child, a boy of perhaps 8, stood slightly apart with the wary expression of someone who had learned not to expect help. "You are Ada Marin," Ingeborg said. It was not a question. "I am. The woman who taught me how to read the wind is dead. She told me to find you before she died." Ada looked at the family standing before her, exhausted, desperate, clinging to the last shred of hope that someone might know how to keep them alive through another winter. "Come inside," she said. "We will talk about what you need." Ingeborg stayed for 2 weeks. She learned faster than anyone Ada had taught. Her hands were already skilled from years of farm work. Her mind grasped the principles behind the techniques, not just what to do, but why each step mattered. She asked questions Ada had not thought to answer, questions that forced Ada to articulate knowledge she had absorbed without fully understanding. "Why does the entry curve to the right instead of the left?" Ingeborg asked on the 4th day. Ada paused. She had built her entry curving right because that was how Marta had shown her, but she had never asked why. "The prevailing wind comes from the northwest," she said slowly, working through the logic as she spoke. "If the entry curves right, the wind has to turn twice to enter, once at the tunnel mouth, once at the interior threshold. Each turn costs the wind force. Would it matter which way the curve went? It would matter based on where the wind comes from. On a different site, with different wind patterns, the curve might need to go the other way." Ingeborg nodded. She filed the information away the same way Ada had learned to file information away, not as rules to follow, but as principles to apply. By the end of 2 weeks, Ingeborg knew enough to begin work on her own claim. She left with her children, a bundle of written instructions Ada had prepared, and a promise to send word when the first layer of clay was cured. The word came in August. The dome was half finished. The children were helping with the willow work. The word came again in October. The dome was complete. They had moved inside. The eldest boy had asked if he could build a wood cache like Ada's. The word came in February, after the first hard storm of that winter. The dome had held. The children were alive. Ingeborg had taught 2 neighboring women how to build curved entries. The knowledge was spreading. By the winter of 1889, Milo had rebuilt his cabin's entry as a curved tunnel. Ada had not expected him to finish. She had expected him to grow frustrated with the slowness, the patience, the endless waiting between layers. She had expected him to abandon the project halfway through and return to his drafty cabin with its straight walls and leaking seams. But he had not abandoned it. He had come back day after day, week after week, learning to dig clay and weave willow and mix the precise ratio of grass to mud that made the seal hold. He had rebuilt his entry 3 times. The first 2 attempts failed when the clay cracked during curing, and he had torn them down and started over instead of trying to patch his way through inadequate work. The 3rd attempt held. Ada went to see it in December. after the first real cold snap had tested the new construction. She walked through the curved tunnel, felt the air temperature change as she moved from exterior to interior, noted the places where Milo's technique was still rough but functional. "It works," she said. Milo was standing by his fire, watching her assessment. His expression was unreadable. "I did not think it would," he said. "When I started, I thought the curve was a trick, something that sounded good but would not matter when the wind came. And now? Now my fire burns half what it burned last winter. Now I do not wake to ice on the inside of my walls. Now I understand why you stayed on that ground when everyone said you should leave." He paused. The fire cracked and popped in the silence. "I took your wagon," he said. "I took your team. I took the lumber that should have been yours. I told myself it was business, that the debt was real, that I was only claiming what I was owed. I remember. I was not claiming what I was owed. I was taking what was yours because I could, because you were a widow with no power and I was a man with a piece of paper, and I thought that meant I was right." Ada did not respond. She had known this, had known it since the moment he dismounted from his horse with that paper in his hand. But hearing him say it, hearing him acknowledge the truth he had spent more than a year avoiding, was different from knowing it. "I cannot give back what I took," Milo said. "The team is gone. The lumber is built into my barn. The time you spent surviving because of what I did, that time is gone." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I was wrong. I'm saying you should have died on that ground, according to everything I believed. And you did not die. You built something better than anything I have ever built, and you did it with nothing, and I did not help you. I tried to make sure you would fail." He met her eyes. "I cannot give back what I took, but I can stop pretending I was right to take it." It was not an apology. It was not restitution. It was something harder than either of those things, an admission of fault with no expectation of forgiveness. Ada thought about the woman she had been in October of 1887, the widow with $11 and a son and a lean-to that could not survive the first real wind, the woman who had begged the river for something, anything, that might keep her alive. That woman would have wanted revenge. That woman would have wanted Milo to suffer the way she had suffered. But Ada was not that woman anymore. She was the woman who had built a dome from river debris. She was the woman who had sheltered 5 people through a blizzard that killed hundreds. She was the woman who had taught neighbors and strangers and even her enemy how to survive. "I do not forgive you," she said. "What you did cannot be forgiven, but I am done carrying it." She walked out through Milo's new entry tunnel, felt the wind turn twice before it could reach the interior, and went home. Jonas Felt arrived in the spring of 1890. He came to the river district to set up a smithing operation, not a full forge, just a small setup for repairs and simple fabrication. The nearest blacksmith was in Yankton, 12 miles away, and the settlers along the river needed someone closer who could fix a broken hinge, repair a cracked tool, fabricate the small metal pieces that frontier life constantly required. He was 36 years old, widowed for 3 years, quiet in the way of men who had learned that talking did not solve most problems. He had hands that were scarred from hot metal and calloused from hammerwork. He had eyes that noticed how things were built before he noticed the people who built them. He noticed Ada's dome on his second day in the district. "What is that?" he asked the man who was showing him around, a settler named Gunderson, who had adopted a curved entry after the January blizzard. "That is Ada Marin's place, the widow who built the roundhouse." "Built it from what?" "River debris, driftwood and roots and clay. Nobody thought it would stand, and then it held 5 people through the worst storm any of us had seen." Jonas did not say anything more, but the next day he rode to Ada's claim and asked permission to look at the structure. Ada was patching a section of the wood cache that had settled over the winter. She looked up at the stranger on horseback, tall, weathered, watching her work with an intensity that was not quite rude, but was certainly direct. "You want to see the dome," she said. "I want to understand how you built it." "Why?" "Because I fix things for a living. I cannot fix something I do not understand." It was a reasonable answer. Ada set down her tools and showed him. He walked the perimeter the way Nell had walked it, the way Voss had walked it, the way everyone who came to see the dome walked it, but his attention was different. He was not looking at the surface, the clay, the sod, the curved shape. He was looking at the connections, the joints, the places where one material met another. "The frame is roots," he said. "Driftwood roots. They interlock instead of stacking. And the willow holds the clay. The willow weave creates a mesh. The clay bonds to it. What holds the smoke cap? Bent willow and sinew. The weighted flap can be adjusted from inside." Jonas crouched beside the entry tunnel and examined the curve. He ran his hand along the sealed surface, feeling for the seams between clay layers. "This is better than most things I've seen built with proper materials," he said. "It works." "It does more than work. It thinks." He stood and looked at her. "You designed this yourself?" "I learned the principles from a woman named Marta Red Elk, the specific design I worked out as I built." "The woman who taught you, she is dead?" "She died last spring." Jonas nodded slowly. He did not offer condolences. He simply acknowledged the fact and moved on. "I am setting up a smithing operation on the Gunderson claim," he said. "I will be making repairs, fabricating small pieces. If you need metalwork, vent rings, door hinges, tool repairs, I would like to help. I cannot pay much. I am not asking for much. I am asking to be useful to someone who builds things worth fixing." It was an odd way to phrase an offer, but Ada found she understood it. He was not offering charity. He was offering a trade, his skills for access to knowledge, his metal work for the chance to understand how her structure worked. "Come back next week," she said. "I need a better rim for the smoke cap. The willow warps when it rains." "I will come back." He did. The courtship, if it could be called that, happened through work. Jonas came to repair the smoke cap rim. He stayed to help reinforce the entry tunnel. He returned the next month to fabricate a simple hinge for the door blanket frame. He returned the month after that to see how his repairs were holding. Each visit, they talked. Not about feelings, not about futures, not about the things that courtship usually involved. They talked about materials. They talked about techniques. They talked about the difference between building something that would last and building something that would merely stand. Ada found herself looking forward to his visits. Not because he was handsome, he was not particularly, or because he was charming, he was not that either, but because he listened, because he asked questions that made her think, because he looked at what she had built and saw not a strange mound on a riverbank, but something worth understanding. Thomas liked him. That mattered more than Ada wanted to admit. "Jonas knows how to make things," Thomas said one evening after Jonas had left. "Like you do. He makes different things than I make. But he thinks about them the same way. He thinks about why they work, not just how they look." Ada looked at her son, 9 years old now, growing into someone who noticed things, who thought about the world the way she had learned to think about it. "Yes," she said, "he does." They married in the summer of 1891. It was not a grand wedding. There was no church on the river, no minister closer than Yankton. They stood in front of Elias Voss, who had been appointed justice of the peace the previous year, and exchanged vows that were simple and direct. Jonas moved into the dome. It was crowded with 3 people, but they made it work. He built a small smithing setup on the property, not a full forge, just a charcoal fire and an anvil and the basic tools of his trade. He repaired tools for the neighbors. He fabricated the metal pieces that Ada's designs increasingly required. And he learned. He learned to weave willow, though his fingers were too thick for the finest work. He learned to mix clay, though he never developed Ada's sense for the right consistency. He learned the principles that Marta had taught Ada, and he added principles of his own: metal reinforcement for stress points, iron pins to anchor root connections, steel rims that did not warp the way willow warped. Together they improved the design. Together they taught others. Together they built something larger than either of them could have built alone. The years passed the way years pass on the frontier, slowly when you are living them, quickly when you look back. A daughter was born in 1892. They named her Marta, though Ada never told anyone why. A son was born in 1894. They named him Thomas, after Ada's first son, who was by then helping Jonas with the smithing. The dome expanded, first the wood cache, then a small addition for the children, then a covered passage connecting the living space to Jonas's smithing area. Each addition followed the same principles: curved shapes, layered clay, earth insulation. Each addition made the structure stranger to look at and more comfortable to live in. Neighbors stopped calling it the Beaver Lodge. They started calling it the Marin Place, or sometimes just Ada's Place, as if the structure and the woman who built it had become the same thing. By 1895, there were 11 domes and dome-influenced structures along the river. Some were full replicas of Ada's design. Some were conventional cabins with curved entries and improved ceiling. Some were experiments, variations, new applications of the principles Ada had learned from Marta and taught to anyone who asked. Ada kept writing. She had filled 3 notebooks with instructions, diagrams, explanations. She had begun teaching Thomas to teach others, passing the knowledge to the next generation the way Marta had passed it to her. "You should publish this," Jonas said one evening, looking at her notebooks spread across their small table. "Publish it how?" "There are newspapers, agricultural journals, people who write about how settlers live." "Would anyone read it?" "Someone built a round house from river debris and survived a blizzard that killed hundreds of people. Someone taught a dozen families how to do the same thing. Yes, people would read it." Ada looked at her notebooks. She thought about Marta, who had taught her everything and received nothing in return, except the knowledge that the teaching would continue. She thought about Ingeborg, who had walked 12 miles with 3 children to learn how to keep them alive. She thought about all the people who had come to her claim, skeptical or desperate or curious, and left knowing something they had not known before. "I will write it properly," she said, "not just notes, something anyone could follow." She started that night. The final piece of Milo's arc came in the winter of 1897. A severe cold snap hit the river district in January, not as bad as the blizzard of '88, but bad enough to test every structure along the water. Temperatures dropped to 30 below zero. Snow piled against walls. Wind found every gap, every seam, every weakness. Milo's curved entry held. His rebuilt cabin, with its improved ceiling and better designed fire pit, held heat the way a cabin was supposed to hold heat. His children, he had 3 now, having remarried in '92, slept warm through nights that would have frozen them in the drafty structure he had lived in before. He came to Ada's claim after the cold snap broke. He did not come to ask for help this time. He came carrying something. "My wife made this," he said, handing her a quilt. It was heavy, well made, sewn from scraps of fabric in a pattern Ada did not recognize. "What is it for?" "It is for your children. A thank you for what you taught me." Ada looked at the quilt, then at Milo. He was older now. They were all older, with gray in his beard and lines around his eyes that had not been there when he rode to her claim with his piece of paper and his claim to everything she had. "You came to take things from me once," she said, I did. Now you come to give things. I do. She took the quilt. It was warm in her hands, heavier than it looked. This does not make us even, she said. Nothing could make us even, but it is what I have. Ada nodded. She did not invite him inside. She did not offer tea or conversation, but she kept the quilt and she put it on her daughter's bed that night, and she did not think about Milo with hatred anymore. It was not forgiveness. It was something else, something that had no name but felt like the end of a long, cold winter. Ada Marin lived on the river lot until 1912. She saw the territory become a state. She saw the railroad come within 5 miles of her claim. She saw the river change course 3 times, each flood reshaping the landscape she had learned to read like a language. She never moved to a conventional house. Even when lumber became cheap enough that she could have afforded one, even when Jonah suggested they might be more comfortable in something with windows and a proper door, she stayed in the structure she had built from the river's waste. This is where I learned who I was, she said when Jonas asked why. This is where I became someone who could survive. Jonas died in 1908, quietly, in his sleep. Ada found him in the morning, cold but peaceful, and buried him on the rise above the dome where the roots were thickest. She lived 4 more years after that. She kept teaching, kept writing, kept refining the knowledge she had spent a lifetime gathering. Her notebooks filled 3 shelves by the time she stopped. Her daughter Marta had memorized most of them. Her grandchildren knew the principles, even if they did not remember the specifics. The last entry in her final notebook, written in a hand that trembled but did not stop, said this: "Shape is what the wind hears first. Build what the wind cannot seize, and you will survive what the wind brings." She died in December of 1912, 68 years old, in the dome she had built from driftwood and roots and river clay. Her daughter found her in the morning, lying on the sleeping platform Marta Red Elk had helped her design, warm under the quilt that Milo's wife had sewn. In the decades that followed, 73 families along the Missouri and its tributaries built structures that traced their principles back to Ada Marin's dome. Most were conventional cabins with curved entries and improved ceiling, adaptations rather than replicas. But 7 were full domes, round houses built from river materials, standing in cottonwood bottoms where no one would have thought to build before a widow proved it could be done. The last of those original domes stood until 1947, when a flood finally undercut its foundation and carried it downstream in pieces. The family who had lived there rebuilt it 200 yards farther from the water using the same techniques, following instructions written in notebooks that had been copied and recopied for 60 years. Return then to January 12, 1888. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 8 hours. Snow came sideways, driven by wind that erased the world. Across the northern plains, children froze walking home from school. Cattle died standing upright. Settlers who had survived 5 winters, 10 winters, 20 winters, died in shacks that could not hold heat against the cold. Elias Voss, who had survived 21 winters and buried one hired hand to the cold, stood in Ada Marin's dome that night and watched a fire the size of 2 fists keep 5 people alive. He had ridden to that dome because his own cabin had failed, because his west wall had opened and the chinking had blown loose, because everything he knew about building had not been enough. "When the north wind comes," he had told her in October, "that thing will open by morning, and your boy will freeze before dawn." Morning came. The dome did not open. The boy did not freeze. The structure that everyone called a beaver pile was the only one on that stretch of river that sounded smaller than the wind. Its curved walls turned the storm aside. Its layered clay held where chinking failed. Its entry tunnel forced cold air to climb instead of flooding the interior. Ada Marin had built it from $11.40, from driftwood and roots and river clay, from knowledge passed down by a woman who knew what the wind would hear first. She had built it because there was no other way. And because there was no other way, she found the one way that worked. The last image is simple. Dawn light through a cleared smoke cap, coals glowing in a fire pit ringed with flat stones, a boy asleep against the curved back wall of a house that should not exist, and a woman whose cracked hands still smell of river clay, watching the sky clear over a world that tried to kill her and failed.